So hi, I'm Terry Elton,
And I'm Eric Elton.
and in addition to being married, we both served in ministries, and we're going to talk about budgeting, as I happen to marry an accountant. Isn't that convenient? So today, Eric, if you'll talk about both as you've served on ministry and done budgeting in ministry, but also as you had that other hat when you were an accountant before you served in ministry. Deal?
We can do it.
So budgeting 101. So let's talk about overall church budget. Let's say I'm a small ministry and there's not a lot of staff and I'm kind of in charge of leading the budget. I've heard of this thing called a narrative budget. And I've heard and I've seen ones that just have every kind of area and all these details. Tell me about what benefit both of those have.
So the most logical one that most people start off with would be just the flat out numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Starting with your debits and credits, your expenses and income. And the whole idea there is that there needs to be some form of income coming in to help support it. Now, it could be a registration or a fee,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be the offering. But when you're working with a specific program, you need to make sure that it ties in with the greater, bigger budget. If you're relying solely on offerings, you need to make sure that it stays within the guidelines that the accounting person, the treasurer of the congregation, or maybe you have a bookkeeper, has given you some ideas and some parameters as to what.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly, if the youth ministry is covered under the budget, there's no fees. But if we have camp and there's fees, and we're paying that expense from the budget, then we need to have an income line that has fees that would have the camp fees there.
Correct. And then on the lower side of that, then it's all the different expenses. So continuing on with the camp idea, so there's probably going to be some transportation.
Yeah.
So you need to figure out the transportation cost. Call the bus company, call the van rental place, call whatever it is. T-shirts you're going to have every team member wear that goes to camp. What are all the different components that you have that are going to be part of this? And the question that someone is going to ask is that income that you're bringing in for those camp fees going to cover the T-shirt, going to cover the art projects, going to cover the transportation? Or is that money also coming from a different part of the budget over here? And there's different ways of handling it. And some churches might say, nope, it all has to stem from that registration fee. Well, then what needs to happen is that registration fee has to be higher than what you're going to be sending to the camp so that you can cover those other expenses.
So if I was the pastor, let's say there's only one pastor, and I'm working with the executive team of the council, and we're putting together the budget, I would get all of that stuff maybe from the youth ministry committee or some sub-team, and then I would put it together for the big budget.
Right.
And so in the reporting that we would give to the congregation, would you have just youth ministry, or would you have maybe 5 subcategories, or would you have all the details?
So you could bury people in details, and that's probably not super helpful for the very small percentage of people that really care that deeply. But you might want to say, here's what we do during the school year, day to day, week to week, for let's say the program year, which is oftentimes the school year. This is how that operates. And then over here then, you might have that trip to camp or the ski trip. Those will need to feed into youth ministry, but more than likely, most accounting people are going to want to know, how did that standalone event do financially? So that if it doesn't do well, then one can say, next time we need to make sure we charge a higher fee for it. Or if it does land well, some financial people might say, oh, that's a one we got to do next year because that actually generated income for us. Sometimes ministries aren't there to generate income for the greater good. Sometimes it may be the fee was too high and it needs to be adjusted, well, maybe down next year, or if it loses money, then next year you got to raise it up again.
So one of the things I'm hearing you say is that good budgeting practices and accounting practices tell a story. Help us say, here's how we're using the assets, at least the financial assets, to for youth ministry, for worship, that at the end of the year, a good budgeting process, not only on the front end, helps us anticipate, but on the back end, we can say, how did we actually do compared to what we had planned?
Right. Correct.
And then make decisions moving forward.
Yep.
So tell me about what's a narrative budget, or what is another way to tell the story of money?
Well, on the ministry side, we often want to go to the heart. Who's being touched by God in the heart? Who is being impacted by this? And so sometimes it might be how many kids went on that trip? Okay? How important is that? Well, it's a high percentage of the total kid or student population of the church. That's a good thing. So then all of a sudden you look at that and you say, wow, it generated a lot of income. So it is really, really good, because then we know more kids were touched by God, it balances in the budget, and everybody's happy. Now there is another scenario that says, well, it didn't generate as much income, but we still had a high population of people. And financial people will quickly go to, wow, that did not support itself. But then you as a ministry person would need to say, but you know what? We had X number of kids more that actually went on the retreat, and that is important. And maybe what happened in there, maybe there's some kids that were scholarships. Say that 5 kids couldn't afford to go. And it was worth it to have a negative result, if you will, to have those 5 kids go. It isn't so much about balancing the budget and having everything being neat and tidy like many accounting people want to have it. But there's also, the heart has to come in there. Mm-hmm. And somewhere in there between the debits and the credits and the income and expenses, the heart has to play in there. And
I think that also aligns in, I think of strategic planning. I think of, for example, congregations that have chosen not to charge for Sunday school, and they see that that is going to be an expense we just take on. So having those expense items line up with strategy or ministry goals is another piece. So, what do we do with restricted gifts?
Well, there's been a time and a place over the years where many congregations will have the opportunity to give towards a special thing. Good financial people are going to honor that gift. Good churches are going to honor that gift and make sure that money actually ends up in that bucket. And so money comes in to the church, and let's just say it is for a new organ. Okay, so $50,000 comes in for an organ from multiple people, and it needs to make sure it goes into that budget. Oftentimes, many churches will put that into restricted giving because it might take some time to generate all the income to actually pay off that bill. And so it stays in restricted, and it cannot be used for lights, electricity, salary, anything like that. It stays in the organ fund. And then it's now, let's say that all happened in the current year. Now let's flip into January, February, March of the next year. And now you actually have that $50,000. And now you can say, we need to go out and buy that. Well, those monies then do not come out of operations. They come out of restricted giving. So that $50,000 that was put into restricted giving now goes out to pay the bills. Now, there's a common practice in many nonprofits, not just churches, but nonprofits in general, that says, wow, I could borrow from restricted giving.
Right.
And it would be zero interest to help make sure that we covered our utilities or our salary because there was a slow season in the summer or something like that. That is risky. It is very risky because you have to replenish those resources.
So we've talked about overall budgeting. Now let's talk about how do you plan specific events?
Well, let's say that you're taking a youth group to camp. And let's say that your target is 50 people. And you need to figure out how much revenue you need to bring in. 1, to cover the costs of the camp. And 2, to cover any transportation, fuel, insurance, any of those things. Maybe you're getting a t-shirt for the group or art supplies or things like that. And so you need to make, to the best of your ability, set up a cost or a fee that covers all those expenses based on the number of people you have and the total cost.
Now ideally, you would not probably, if they've gone to camp before, be the first one to do this. So talk about how good budget practices over time help us create a story even when staff leave.
If this is a repeated event, the most important thing you can do is go back and look at history. So you might want to look at last year's history or the year before, and you might want to look at head counts, how many people are going on to camp each of those years. Look at transportation costs, look at registration fees, all those components, and establish whether there's a pattern that is similar, and you'll find out whether there was a positive thing. So there's actually money that was left over at the end that could be given to the church budget, or to the other side is like, oh, maybe we didn't charge enough, and so next year, the one you're planning now, you have to add more to the cost so that you can make sure that you get into a more of a positive situation.
Good budgeting helps us do good ministry, not only for planning purposes, and but also trustworthiness with the congregation. That sometimes there's a tension between what that feels like is the calling of the ministry leaders and of the finance team.
Yeah. Finance people don't like to have surprises. Those of us that are in ministry, we usually get pretty close. We might get 75-80% of things planned out really well. But then we might forget about something and we just kind of say, oh, that's okay. I charge enough in there, so we're not going to lose any money. You could do that, but more or at some point in time, eventually there's going to be friction between ministry and finance. Finance is just trying to do their job. Ministry is trying to do their job. There is a place to find, it's in the middle, that is a good place to be. It's healthy. It creates a little tension, but that's just fine. But it also, in the end, hopefully makes both sides of the equation, if you will, accountable.
So we talked earlier about income and expenses, and one of the things that I know from my years, at least in program ministry, that the expenses are not always equal every month. How do we kind of take that roller coaster of expenses and income, and how can budgeting help us navigate that so we have the money when we need it?
And what you need to do is you need to make sure that you can find a happy balance. And one of the best ways to do it is go back in history. Look at the previous 2 years, see what the trends were. If you find that you have a tremendous growth in your congregation, you can add some cushion to that. If you find out that your congregation is plateaued and flat, no change, you have to accommodate for that. And if it's gone backwards, you have to accommodate for that too. The reality of it is, with our budgets, when it comes to offerings and stuff, we have to lift this to God and help us provide the best we possibly can.
Well, there is so much more regarding finance in the congregation. But this is just a little taste of how good budgeting practices can be used for a tool, not only for decision making, but also to be trustworthy for the congregation. And I think in the end, that's our hope. Is there anything else you want to leave us with as we end this session?
Yeah, I think we ministry people want to believe to the nth degree that God is abundant. And we all know that. Financial people are always going to be on the other side. They're always going to hold back. They're going to be conservative and all that stuff. And we have to understand that that's okay too. But as I mentioned before, you got to have that balance. I think God still honors planning. I think God still honors the financial people, and so the more we can use be diligent about balancing life from the past and creating the future and all that, the better off we would be.
And budgeting is a way to tell a story. And some of us may not be good with the numbers, but may be good with telling stories. And then we need to just partner with people that are good with numbers, or vice versa. So, thanks for watching.